Good evening and welcome. My name is Bruce Campbell. I'm the director of the Latino Latin American Studies program at the College of St. Benedict, St. John's University. I would like to begin with an acknowledgement that both the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University occupy the original homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. We honor, respect, and acknowledge the indigenous peoples forcibly removed from this territory, whose connection remains today. St. Benedict's Monastery and St. John's Abbey previously operated boarding schools for Native children. Now, students, faculty, and staff are working to repair relationships with our Native Nation neighbors. Tonight's event is the third and final event in our spring semester Latino Latin American Studies program series on the theme of labor. Labor is both an economic category, an input in capitalist economics, as in the labor market, labor costs, etc., and a lived human reality, an experience of economic structures, as well as a kind of creative agency or power. Labor, in other words, is both a thing and an embodied social position. As a thing, labor has a price and is used like other economic resources to accomplish defined goals, turning a profit, creating and distributing a thing, etc. As lived human reality, the economic abstraction of labor becomes visible as the field worker, the barista, the house painter, the construction worker, the landscaper, and the actor, and the teacher, and the artist. Importantly, there are also forms of labor that are necessary to the maintenance of a healthy community and society, but that are often not recognized as formal inputs for the economy. Raising children, mutual aid, volunteer work, and other kinds of community care that are not transactional. Our speaker this evening, Aaron Johnson-Ortiz, will be sharing with us some of his work as a mural artist and will help us understand something of the past, present, and future of muralism as both an art movement and as a social, political, and cultural phenomenon. Aaron is a Mexican, Latino, and Mexican-American cultural organizer, arts advocate, and award-winning neo-muralist based in Minnesota. His art focuses on workers' rights, immigrants' rights, Latino culture, and Mexican identity. His mural, Workers United in Struggle, was named the 2018 Best Mural in the Twin Cities by City Pages. Please join me in a warm welcome for Aaron Johnson.
All right, thank you, Bruce. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit, obviously, about muralism. I'm not going to get too much into the history of muralism, although I think we can talk maybe about that in the Q&A section. And primarily going to talk about my own work, both as an artist as well as an arts administrator. So I work with a lot of other public artists. Some of them are muralists, some of them are sculptors, painters, other kinds of artists. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And most of the work here is based in Minnesota, but you'll see some work from Mexico as well. By the way, I go by Aaron or Aaron. Either one is fine. And I'm originally from Minnesota, so I'm happy to be sharing my work. And thank you, Bruce, for inviting me and for everybody here. It's actually a lot more students than I expected. Okay, so I'm going to go over basically some of the examples of the kinds of work that we've been promoting and working on over the past couple of years. And Setul is a worker center. I think Bruce mentioned the mural that we did there a couple of years ago. And then Clues, I know some of the students who were here today and they were familiar with Clues. Does anybody else know what Clues is? The organization? Some people, okay. It's a Latino social service organization, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then Jeanette said her family's from Lake Street, and so we're going to talk a little bit about the work on Lake Street in 2021 primarily. And then last year we did a big project at the Minnesota State Capitol, and so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then finally, I have some slides that include artists who have come to Minnesota previously and who will be coming this year and coming years. And so I hope to see in what way they can maybe collaborate with the University College here. So this is a little bit of my basically trajectory, at least professionally, after I graduated from my Master's in Fine Arts at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And so I was a community and union organizer for several years. I worked as a labor organizer at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. I was the Graduate Employees Organization lead organizer for a couple of years. I also did a lot of immigrant rights organizing. We were one of the few, or first actually, one of the first counties in the country that stopped holding immigrants at the local jail. This was during the Obama administration in 2010. And after that, I decided that I wanted to go back into art practice. And so I came back to Minnesota. I'm originally from here. And I worked as an independent muralist, earning almost no money at all. I remember one semester, I think I earned like $500 in 6 months. So it was a little bit rough, but I learned a lot about how to become a practicing artist and how to make a living as an artist. And so if there's any art students here who are thinking about doing that, I can talk a lot about that in the Q&A section. Then in 2019, I became the Director of Arts and Culture Engagement at Comunidad Latinas Unidas en Servicio, that's CLUS, and I was there for a couple of years. And then MCA stands for the Mexican Cultural Arts Alliance. This is an organization that I helped start. It's a binational organization based in several states in the United States and in Chiapas, Mexico. And we're, as far as I know, the only binational alliance of Mexican arts and culture in existence currently. And then the last acronym there, and we'll get all those detailed out, is Neomuralismos de Mexico, which is I want to say New Mexican Muralism, but people sometimes think that that's from New Mexico. It's just New Muralism that's from Mexico. So this is one of the first projects that I started working on when I came back to Minnesota. I started working with Setur, and I believe Setur has probably presented here at some point. And so we did a number of projects with them. I helped organize their center into kind of like a gallery space. I did a number of projects with them, like this one. This was part of the May Day parade in 2019, I believe. And then this was a banner that we did with SCIU, primarily janitors and security guards union in Minneapolis. And this was an action at the Minneapolis airport. So we did that banner for SCIU. This is some of the community painting that we did. And I always like to do community workshops with murals because I feel that a mural shouldn't just present to people, but it should also include people in the creation, so that the people who inhabit that space can feel like the wall is actually theirs, the art is actually theirs. And so this was one of the workshops that we did at Setur in 2018, I believe this was. This was part of the mural. It's actually two very long walls that kind of wraps around a building. And so this is one of the sections. This is kind of the centerpiece. And when I first started talking with the workers at Setur, they really wanted to see, kind of like labor history, and there's this sort of tendency of doing labor history in murals. It's a very common thing to put, strikes, Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, Zapata, those kind of the usual characters. But then we started talking about it in a little bit more in depth, and they decided that they actually wanted to have themselves represented in the mural, so we did a little bit of a twist on the traditional labor mural, where each one of these people are workers, community members who are based in the Twin Cities and who are sort of leaders at the Worker Center. So this is, her name is Lexi Collins, and she was one of the people who was leading the fast food worker campaign, and she worked at Taco Bell at the time when we painted this. And then that's Guillermo, he was one of the organizers at Setur. And so anyways, these are folks who are involved with the organization, and we sort of made them into these sort of iconic faces, replacing the kind of traditional icons. So again, from the May Day parade, I think we did 8 of these banners. And actually, the May Day parade in Minneapolis is interesting. It's not, I don't think it's happening this year, or at least not in the same way. But traditionally, it's been associated with the spring, sort of a spring celebration. But of course, the May Day also has a labor history, an important labor history. It's a bit of an irony that the U.S. is the only country that celebrates Labor Day in a different day than in May, even though, for example, in Mexico, when they celebrate Dia de los Trabajadores, that's in May, and it was based on an event that happened in Chicago, and so we should be also celebrating May Day as a Labor Day in the U.S. Okay, so then I started at CLUES in 2019, and CLUES is a social service organization, so they do things like mental health, they do job training, they do English language learning, youth programs, senior programs, that kind of thing. But when I started, there was no arts department, and so I developed the arts department at CLUES, starting in 2019. And so we invited 2 artists for one of our first projects. This is Daniela Valentino, and the other artist is Talia Valentino, and they created a mosaic design for CLUES. So this was a new community center that became a cultural center on the east side of St. Paul. And so one of the first events that we did was invite kids to come in, paint these patterns, and then later on the senior program sort of interpreted the colors of the kids, and they created these mosaic designs. This was also at the opening of the community center. This is in 2019 in August. And this is, we opened the first Latino, or not the first, the only Latino art gallery in Minnesota at the time. Oh, I repeated that one. This is that cute kid painting. I also, in 2019, started a program called the Latino Muralism Apprenticeship Program. And basically, Minnesota has a great mural tradition, and in particular in the past 2 decades, there's been murals kind of coming up all over the place. But we noticed that the Latinos in particular are kind of being left out of the muralism scene, which is a sort of a strange thing because muralism comes from our community. And so I wanted to train existing artists in muralism techniques. And so here's actually 4 different artists, but this is Kyle Tavera, and Samara Cuyón, that's Marina Castillo, and Lisa Benedict. They were all students. They're practicing artists, but they didn't know the techniques of muralism, and so they came in and learned these techniques and helped create this mosaic. And this is kind of what the mosaic looks like in the end. And as you can see, there's the little patterns that the seniors created based on the children's color motifs. And then the rest was created by the 2 lead artists and by the muralism apprentices. That was completed in 2020. It's a depiction of traditional Maya weaver. Okay, so I also like to work with folk artists. So Flor Soto is based in Austin, Minnesota, and she is a piñata artist. And one of the challenges of folk artists oftentimes is that folk art and artisan work in general takes a lot of time, but oftentimes it's not very well paid. And so I like promoting folk artists, and I like also working with folk artists to kind of develop their craft into larger elements. And so this was Flor's first art exhibit, or at least first solo art exhibit anywhere. And based on this exhibit, she's gotten, I believe, 3 or 4 other solo exhibits after that. Unfortunately, that was in the middle of the pandemic, so that was in the fall of 2020. And so our ability to open our art gallery to the public was pretty reduced. And so I worked with her to create this sign. Esperanza means hope in Spanish. And it's using her techniques of making paper flowers, but instead of paper, we used a special plastic that lasted outdoors. I believe the sign is still up today. And it was sort of adapting her folk art techniques into public art, into kind of a 3D muralism concept. Then once people started coming back into the art gallery, at the end of 2021, we had a first major exhibit. It was called Muralismo Minnesotano, which means Minnesotan muralism. And we exhibited the work of the apprentices, as well as a lot of the community created murals. I believe it was about 40 different murals and public art, including sculpture and other kinds of public art that we exhibited. 2021 was also the centennial of the Mexican muralist movement. And as far as I know, we were the only art gallery in the country to celebrate the Mexican muralist movement with an art exhibit, which was, we were happy about doing that, but also it was a little bit sad, considering how many muralism programs there are all over the country. The actual history, the origins of the muralist movement have been almost entirely erased. And so you have major public art organizations and mural organizations around the country that are talking about muralism sort of without origins. And I think for me, for the question of this presentation is what is muralism? And for a lot of people, it's sort of an art form, and I always think of it more as an art movement. As an art movement, it has a cultural origin, it has a geographic origin, it has a time origin. And so for me, it's always important to look back at where things come from, especially in an important art movement that is sort of people-centered and labor-centered and social justice-centered. And so we were very happy to do that. Of course, part of it was also the pandemic. There was a lot of constraints on museums and galleries to put on exhibits in 2021. Last year in Mexico, they started doing several exhibits around the country that were about the centennial, but it was actually in 2021 that was the actual centennial. Oh, so we were on Univision and Televisa and yeah, all over media. Anyway, so then I wanted to talk a little bit about our work on Lake Street. So as I'm sure all of you know, during the pandemic, there was a lot of economic problems for small businesses. And then of course in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, there was a lot of social unrest and a lot of people were displaced. There was a lot of burnings as well. And so in 2020, late 2020 and early 2021, we started meeting with a lot of the community leaders, the small business owners, the community members on Lake Street. And Lake Street historically has been a sort of a Latino culture corridor, economic district. And what they were wanting was something that would kind of revitalize the area, bring it back to life, invite people back into the area, to sort of celebrate culture, but also to mourn many of the things that people lost, whether it was loss of attachment to a place. Social distancing also had a pretty devastating impact on people's mental health, and then of course police brutality and other forms of death, including from the pandemic. And so for us, we as Mexicans, we always think about Day of the Dead. And so we felt that it was a good time to sort of bring that cultural tradition to Lake Street. And so we did a number of projects on Lake Street, starting with this mural. This was actually earlier, this is from 2020. This was one of our first projects on Lake Street. This is what the mural looks like, and it was sort of representation of the solidarity of the Latino community with George Floyd's family and with the Black community in general. But in addition to that mural, we also did a number of Day of the Dead altars throughout Lake Street, and a lot of events, a lot of sort of workshops for children and seniors. And it was a way of sort of bringing attention back to the community on Lake Street. This is Supermercado Morelia. This was one of our first workshops where we invited people to come and cut out little monarch butterflies. So we worked with the business owners to sort of install the altars, but throughout the year, starting in, I believe it was April, we worked with community members to create things. So for example, the flower and some of the papel picado and a lot of the decorations that kind of went in, those were all created with the community. So we were meeting almost every single week to kind of invite people to create this day. These are some of the giant Catrinas. Catrinas are these sort of characters of a fancy, usually female skeleton figure, sometimes they're male. And these were created by artist Gustavo Boada. And so we had a community procession for Day of the Dead on Lake Street. We kind of went through George Floyd Square, by Powderhorn, and then kind of walked up Chicago Avenue up to Lake Street, and then had kind of a festival, and both to bring people back to the corridor, but also to honor the dead. So it was very successful, our 2021 work, and then in 2022 we decided that we wanted to sort of expand to something that was a little bit more higher impact even. We had a much smaller budget, so I left my work at Clues, and my sister and I and a number of other people started a new arts organization. And so beginning an arts organization generally means that you don't have any money, so we didn't have almost any money at all. But we were thinking, how can we make an important public art project with not a lot of resources, but using our cultural traditions and sort of honoring our artists. And so we invited Flor Soto, who is the paper mache artist that I mentioned earlier, and Monica Vega, who's primarily a maker of Day of the Dead altars. And they created this altar in the background for the Minnesota State Capitol. And as it turns out, it was the first altar at the Minnesota State Capitol ever. And it was recognized by the governor here, Governor Waltz, and I believe, there's Monica at the press conference talking about why Day of the Dead is really important to her, and talking about her family members. That's Lieutenant Governor and the Attorney General. For me, I always do Day of the Dead because it's important to my family, but also my brother passed away in 2015, and so for me it's always important to include him in the altar. And so this is when I was telling the governor and Lieutenant Governor Keith Ellison about my brother, and also about health insurance. Latinos have the lowest rates of health insurance in the state, and so I wanted to kind of, my brother passed away, and he, for most of his life, didn't have health insurance, and so I wanted to kind of express that to them and ask them to change that. That's Monica giving Catrina to the governor. So this was also enormously successful. It was on NPR, on several news outlets, and we actually talked with the governor's staff, and as it turns out, it was the first. Oh, we received a state proclamation. I don't know if you see that. So this is like a state recognition of the altar itself, but also of Day of the Dead. And we talked with the Minnesota Council of Latino Affairs, which is the sort of state organization that works with Latinos in Minnesota. And they said that they kind of did research around the country, couldn't find any other state that had recognized Day of the Dead. This is a very strange thing because it's a very important tradition for our community. And so as a result of the altar that we created, Minnesota became the first state in the country to officially recognize Day of the Dead. Okay, this is sort of going forward. This is Anton Vasquez, and he's an artist who's coming in the fall. I think I was telling Bruce about this. Anton Vasquez is a multimedia artist, but primarily works in painting and drawing. And he's coming as a resident artist in the fall. This is part of our ongoing work to create cultural exchanges with artists based in Mexico. We've done that for the past 2 years. We brought artists from Oaxaca and from Morelos, and this year, and I think in coming years, we're going to really focus on Chiapas. Anton is a Maya Tzotzil indigenous person, and he'll be here in September, and I hope maybe we can bring him to the college here as well. This is just some of his work that he's that I'm presenting now, but once he comes here, he'll share his work as well. So he's done some muralism, these really colorful murals, and he does painting. It's primarily acrylic painting. And then next year, we're gonna bring a second artist, Angel Lopez, who's also my associate, but from a different town, from Chamula in Chiapas. And he paints, you know, the traditional clothing of his town. He's more of a realistic painter. So this is some of his work. He works primarily in oil, whereas Anton works primarily in acrylic. So a lot of iconography of his community. So in February of this year, Anton and Angel came to Guadalajara, Mexico, which is sort of a different part of the country, and I worked with them to kind of develop their muralism skills. One of the reasons I like working on muralism is that artists oftentimes can't sell their work at good prices, but if you work in large scales and permanent public art forms, you can charge a lot more money. So this is a way to get more money. So this is part of my ongoing sort of training of artists to become muralists. And this is the two pieces that were created in February. These are mobile paintings, but they can be installed permanently on a wall. And then the third artist that I think will bring in 2025 is Patricia Mota. She's also a Chiapas-based artist. Patricia leads an organization in Chiapas called Portales del Arte in Chiapas. And it's kind of an arts collective that you're developing a community center. I believe it's 40 different artists who are participating in this. And she's a painter and a muralist, and I hope she'll be able to come to Minnesota as well. This is some of Patricia's painting. Okay, so now I want to move a little bit into our work outside of Minnesota. In 2020, a group of sort of cultural leaders around the country got together. Myself, my colleague in Chicago, a colleague in Indianapolis, and one in Denver, Colorado. And we got together with the president of the National Museum of Mexican Art, Carlos Toledo, who's this guy over here. We just felt that you know, Latinos in general are pretty thoroughly underrepresented in media, in the art world, but Mexicans in particular are almost entirely erased from a lot of discussions about you know, contemporary art and contemporary representation. And so we started a new alliance. It's called the Mexican Cultural Arts Alliance. I mentioned it a little bit in the beginning. And since then, we've grown to 8 organizations. So now we're represented in Georgia, Indiana, Illinois, obviously Minnesota, Colorado, and Utah and California. And then additionally, we work with the Chiapas, with Api's organization in Chiapas. And we're currently the only binational arts organization focused on Mexican arts and culture. And this is some of us. This was an exhibit of Frida Kahlo that Fernando, who's based in West Chicago, put on last year. It's our alliance. So I want to talk a little bit about why this is important. This is Mexicans and Latinos in the U.S. Right now, there's probably around 42 million Mexicans or Mexican Americans in the United States. This decade, we're probably going to become one of the largest, if not the largest, cultural minority in the country. We're about, you know, around 60% of us, of Latinos in the U.S. are Mexican, roughly. And Latinos have been the largest BIPOC minority in the country since around 1996. Yep, so some of the numbers. This is Minnesota specifically. So the numbers in Minnesota are lower, but the growth population, or the rate of growth has been faster. So just in the past 20 years, we've grown about 141%. So that's about 10 times the rate of population growth in the state, which is 14%. There's around 350,000 Latinos in Minnesota, and about 2/3 of us are Mexican or Mexican American. Mexicans are the largest immigrant group in Minnesota, and probably will become the largest minority community as well in Minnesota this decade. This is representation. So on the one hand, I wanted to share the numbers because our community is very, very large and it's growing very fast. This is actually how we're represented in the media. This is a study from, I believe it was from last year, of movie representations of Latinos. So even though we're 18% of the population, it was less than 5% in the movies. And TV roles, as you can see, we're also around 5% more or less TV. This is a study by the National Endowment for the Arts. It's called the Survey of Public Participation in the Arts, and this was from 2017, 2018, and 2019. And it shows public participation, in other words, people in general going to art activities, visual arts, so for example, art exhibits, performing arts, theater or music, any kind of performing arts, any kind of visual arts. And as you can see, Latinos are amongst the lowest represented, and oftentimes the lowest represented in terms of arts access. And this is nationwide. So even though we're kind of, in terms of one of the fewest represented in terms of arts access and in terms of media, this was a study that was published, I think, this year, relatively recently, talking about equity of Latinos. And even in the public dialogue around equity, Latinos are still vastly underrepresented in any kind of news articles about racial equity. Okay, so these are our arts organizations, Mexican arts organizations around the country and in Mexico. This is, again, the community leaders. And so anyway, so I am the executive director of an organization called Muralism in Mexico, and we focus on Mexican art, Mexican public art, Latino public art, cultural organizing, and it's an organization that I started last year. It's my first time that I've ever been sort of director of an arts organization. And so it's been a bit of a challenge to get our 501c3 status, do fundraising, do all the stuff that go into leading an organization, but we've been so far pretty successful. And we're developing partnerships with artists and institutions around the country. That's the Instagram of the organization. That's not my personal Instagram. But if anybody wants to follow our art activities, that's us. And maybe you should open up for questions now. Thank you. That's just.
Don't be shy.
Yeah, I don't bite.
How did you get into art and like muralism?
That's a good question. So I've always been an artist since I was a little kid. So I've always been drawing. I never really got into it. I just sort of was always doing it. I actually kind of moved away from art a little bit after grad school. I was a little bit disillusioned with just the art world in general. I felt that everything was sort of about very kind of prestigious exhibits and which museum you're getting into, which residency you're doing, and I never really cared about that. I cared more about art in the community. And so after grad school, I started doing community organizing and union organizing, and I left art on the side. It made me, I like my job a lot, but it sort of made me kind of sad. And so that's why I came back to Minnesota in 2015 to start making art again. And this is really the first time that I've been able to do a little bit of both, which is sort of do sort of the organizational side of things, community side of things, but also spend time on my own artistic practice.
It seems like there's kind of an inherent political message in muralism, and I understanding that right? And could you offered to talk a little bit more about the history of muralism?
Sure. So just not to get too detailed, but I guess my concern always when people talk about murals is that really they're talking about painting on walls, and it's sort of like, expressionism is an art movement, right? But that doesn't mean that the expressionists were the first people to express themselves through art, right? And so muralism is an art movement. It's not just putting paint on the wall. Painting on walls is really ancient, and it's not specific to Mexico or to Mexicans. But as an art movement, it is certainly something that's sort of comes out of the Mexican Revolution. I believe you said, Bruce, you had said something about presentation about the Mexican Revolution. Was that this year or some other year?
Different year.
Okay.
Different year, yeah.
Well, anyways, the Mexican Revolution was 1910 to 1920, approximately, and so after the revolution, muralism was developed as kind of a strategy of public education. So SEP, which is the Secretaría de Educación Popular or Pública, so basically the public education department in Mexico was established after the revolution, and one of the first programs that they created was the muralism program. And the reason for that was that most Mexicans at the time couldn't read, and so public art was one way of teaching about history. And so that's why the muralist movement starts as basically a public education about the revolution and about Mexican history. So yes, it's absolutely something that was always based in sort of social movements and storytelling and history. I think you had a question.
You talked about the importance of including the communities that are living in these areas in the process of creating the mural. Do you have any strategies for how you've done that, both in planning the design and in like creating it?
Are you a painter?
A little bit.
Yeah.
I'm working with Bruce on the mural team.
Oh, and this mural or different mural?
A new one.
A new mural. Is it primarily students who are being represented, or are you trying to get other people?
We're kind of talking about labor justice in general,
Okay.
but we want to include the students here in the design.
Yeah. Strategies. Well, a couple of things. One is that I find that a lot of community-made murals sometimes get a little bit chaotic because everybody has a different idea about what should be represented, and then you end up with a lot of kind of disparate elements that don't really fit together. And so generally, I would say that there has to be some kind of aesthetic lead, whether that's an individual artist or whether it's a small team of artists. And I think the community's involvement is not to say, paint this, paint this, paint this, and paint this, but rather to have a conversation about what are the things that I care about, or what are the things that are not being represented, what are the things that I feel are being excluded and that I want to see in my community, right? And so to have more of a kind of meta conversation about what is there and what is not there, as opposed to 20 people giving an idea. I want a unicorn, I want a manatee, I want a rainbow, I want grass, it gets kind of ridiculous after a while. So in general, I think the idea is to think more sort of structurally about what is it that is missing here, what way is a certain narrative being told that is excluding parts of the community. That's how I try to approach it. Yeah. Hi.
Right, so tagging along on that, how do you choose the style then? Is that also something that's given? Because I notice that there is a particular style that muralism tends to stay within, or is sort of a zone. But within that, I see a variety of different kinds of what I would call artistic styles coming out in that. So how does that get decided when you're in a group?
You mean when there's more than one artist?
Yeah, or a community project like she's talking about.
How many artists are there?
On our team?
Yeah,
Two-ish.
two-ish? Oh, that's not too hard.
They're sitting right in front. You met Rachel and Madeline. And I should just real quick, not to interrupt too much, but they should show you the design concepts
yeah.
they're working with.
Yeah.
So you have a specific artistic context for Madeline's question.
Yeah.
And I think for Carol's question.
Again, I think it should be artist-driven, so especially the stylistic questions should not be, I don't think the community should really say, oh, I want this color, and I want, because then it's like, then you should paint it, right? And that's okay too. Sometimes the best way of working with community is just giving paint and here's a wall and you make it happen. But generally I get pretty annoyed with like kind of the sort of like top down. A lot of people will talk with artists like they're kind of like printers, you know, and I don't mean printmakers, but like literally a printer. Like I have this idea in my head, you plug into my head and then you come up with the image that's in my head, and it just doesn't work. And again, at that point you should just encourage people to make art and not have them tell you what to do. So generally the artist should be deciding kind of the composition, the color scheme, the brush strokes, those sort of aesthetic questions, I think. Unless it somehow, you know, runs significant sort of contrary to whatever the community is, or if there's some reason why a specific artistic style wouldn't fit with the community.
Going off that, how did you develop your style? Or what I'm seeing is this sort of mosaic, many colors within, kind of impressionistic. I'm just art explaining it to you. I should let you tell.
Well, for one thing, I feel like my style has sort of changed over time. Just personally, and this is just myself speaking as an artist. I'm not telling other artists how to paint or not to paint. But for me, I don't like hyperrealism because I just feel that you should work with a photographer if you want hyperrealism. I don't understand why you would want to paint something that looks just like a photograph. Why not just take the photo? And I mean, there's lots of printing techniques where you can blow a photograph up and glue it onto the wall. So that's one thing I always try to stay away from. In terms of the brush strokes, part of that has to do with the material. So I use Nova Color acrylic paints. They're very vibrant, they're very durable for sort of outdoor usages, and they have a really nice range of colors. And so I like using color whenever I can. And then in terms of the strokes, for me anyways, I like the kind of vibrancy. I feel like it brings it to life. I like it because it feels like there's movement happening, and you know, obviously in a mural everything is kind of static. They don't really change. But with sort of color variation with the brush strokes, at least the effect that it does for me is that as you're walking by, it kind of sort of moves with you. And so yeah, and of course then I like the Impressionists, and I like Van Gogh a lot, and I also like Orozco, who's one of the three big muralists, and they all have this sort of very kind of brushstroke centered approach. But yeah, so for people who work with spray paint, for example, it's a very different. The medium also, or the materials also kind of tell you what works and what doesn't work. So spray paint, you really can't get that kind of that vibrancy, but you can get it with sort of shading, and you can also cover a lot more territory a lot faster. So there's pros and cons to different materials.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you go back to, I'm sorry I missed it, can you re-elaborate just a little bit on like the labor justice sort of message that you try and put into muralism sometimes?
Yeah, so again, going back to maybe a little bit the history of muralism, because it started as something to educate people, because it was something about sort of, let's talk about our own history. It was always about, you know, the kind of proletariat, the masses, a lot of people who couldn't read. Obviously, most people in the U.S. can read now, but not everybody speaks English. And so for me, sort of a modern interpretation of the kind of muralist origin is to think about visual storytelling as something that is not language specific. And so it might have words in it, but a lot of people can see it, and without necessarily speaking English or another language, they can get kind of a story or a message out of it. And so for me, that's a way of making storytelling kind of inclusive. What else? The other thing about murals that is sort of very different than, you know, painting or other forms of art is that, for example, art galleries tend to be very sort of exclusive spaces, art museums. At least in Minnesota, most art museums are free, or some of them are. MIA's free, for example. But there's a lot of museums that charge money to go into, and public art, and muralism specifically, or any kind of outdoor art, is a way of making kind of the museum part of the community, so bringing the museum to the streets.
Thank you.
Yeah. ¿Qué más? I want to know how many art students there are here. Like, who's an art student versus like other things? Who's 2 art students? Really? 3. Oh, hi. And then are other folks like Latin American studies or what? Yeah. Cool.
There are a couple poets in the room too.
Oh, it's poets. Nice. Poetry can go on walls too.
I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about, because mural art, I'll say mural art rather than muralism, mural art has kind of exploded in Minnesota, as you referenced, in the last 5 to 10 years in particular. Accelerated by some new monies being available for example, revitalization of Lake Street, where $150,000 has been dispersed specifically for mural projects. Right?
Way more than that, but yeah, yeah.
But I remember being involved with bringing Mexican muralists, the Research Center of the American Mural, and Jose Luis Soto, who came up and led that project. And we toured him around to look at all different kinds of mural art. And his assessment as someone operating from within the Mexican mural tradition was that there was very little muralism in Minnesota. And this took people aback.
Yeah.
And so I kind of want to hear you kind of elaborate even further on that distinction,
Yeah.
just so people really understand like what, because his assessment was that outside of Mexico, a lot of people don't understand that simply making something big doesn't make it a mural, right? In his from within that tradition.
Yeah, yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, I think, I mean, first of all, any art movement is subjective as to what falls into it or what doesn't, and so you can get into a pretty dicey debate about
For sure.
for that. And even within Mexico, there's a lot of graffiti artists who may or may not see themselves as muralists. Some call themselves street artists or urban artists, or you know, the term neo-muralismo, new muralism, is something that has taken on, and what that means exactly is, you know, again, also debatable. But I think generally speaking, outside of Mexico, there's very little, honestly, respect for the history of muralism and kind of where it comes from. And so for a lot of Mexican artists, it's they go around the world and they're told, oh, I'm a muralist, I'm a muralist, I'm a muralist. And it's like, oh, you're painting a sign for Target. Like, that's, what does that have to do with muralism as an art movement? And so I always try to compare it with other art movements. If I said I was a jazz musician because I like to improvise, you know, my calendar or whatever, and improvisation is part of jazz, I think a jazz musician might find that strange and a bit offensive too. And so for whatever reason, the term mural has sort of become a sort of catch-all phrase or term that has to do with just any kind of somebody putting something on a wall, and that's muralism. And at least from a Mexican perspective, it's there's a much deeper tradition that's rooted in sort of anti-colonialism, anti-capitalism, people's movements, labor struggles, social justice, and all that is very much rooted in the history of the Mexican Revolution, which, by the way, was a very bloody history. And it was, you know, I talked a little bit about the Day of the Dead altar and how it was important to work on Lake Street to make these altars. And to me, that's connected to muralism, right? Because even though they're not painting on walls, it's very much about the community. It's about healing. The muralist movement, when it started, was a way of Mexico to heal from the revolution. By some estimates, like 1 in 10 Mexicans died during the revolution. A lot of Mexicans fled to the U.S. There was a number of lynchings of Mexicans in Texas, which is a story that's barely told at all. By some estimates, it's like 5,000 Mexicans were lynched in Texas, kind of fleeing the revolution. And so it was a bloody era. It was a lot of infighting, a lot of people, or different military organizations sort of fighting against each other, a lot of political instability, and the muralist movement was in a way honoring that and celebrating that, but also sort of bringing things together, sort of bringing the nation together around a sort of a unified narrative. And that's one of the things that public art does, is it sort of takes disparate elements and brings things together. And the purpose of that was to kind of heal the country from all the fighting. And so for me, part of that history is about sort of mourning, and that's why Day of the Dead and muralism are connected for me, because they're both about remembering, celebrating, honoring, and healing through public art. Yeah. So anyways, when I talk about muralism, I often go on to things that are not necessarily paint on walls, but they're still connected for me because they're connected historically in terms of the subject matter.
Any other questions? Yep.
Well, as an art historian who wants to make sure I get it right, so then when I'm talking about people who make murals, we could just call them mural makers.
I call them wall painters.
Wall.
I mean, look, so the term mural is complicated, right?
Yeah.
But before like the 1920s, most people talk about frescoes, even if there were not actually frescoes.
Right,
Like
there's
there were,
true fresco and, yeah.
yeah. So like, for example, I was talking with somebody who was born in Russia, and they still use the term fresco for like any kind of wall painting, right? And there's other terms in art history like monumental painting, architectural painting, religious painting,
Tomb painting.
large-scale cave painting, and all these are murals, at least in the sense of they're paint on different kinds of walls. But for me, it's important to talk about muralism as an art movement that's founded in Mexico in the 1920s and 30s, and the things that kind of came out of that. Yeah.
Is that part? Thank you.
Yeah, wall painting is, I mean, there's a lot of people who are sort of coming out of sign painting. You know, sign painting was a sort of a thing that came out of, well, it's very ancient, but the 1960s and 70s, before you could reproduce, you know, photographs, people would paint signs, you know, announcing a tractor or camera or whatever it was that they wanted to sell. And a lot of contemporary people who call themselves muralists actually are coming more out of a sign painting tradition. Street art, urban art, graffiti, these are all different terms that have specific histories and specific sort of aesthetic concentrations. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question, if anybody has something else.
I got one.
Hi.
Hi, so I'm curious if you could just like, really briefly, I know it's a super long process sometimes, kind of walk through what the process is like when you start. I'm super curious about the community mobilization aspect. Like, how do you mobilize community actors, community stakeholders to get involved in the process? Like, how do you get them to buy in and participate?
It's a great question. The first thing that I would say is oftentimes artists kind of want to do everything, and I mean, I sometimes do that, but honestly, I think it's a bad idea and it's unnecessary. So there's teachers in the community, there's community organizations, there's organizers, there's union leaders, there's religious organizations, there's neighborhood groups. Generally, I would say it's much better to partner with some kind of community organization and let them do the organizing. Yeah, that's what their job is. And usually, when you work with a community organization, they don't work with artists very frequently. They don't understand how art works. They don't understand how public art works. There's a lot of sort of technical expertise that you have to bring to the table. But I think partnering with a community organization makes it a lot easier on the artist. And I think it makes it a lot more authentic, because you're not sort of parachuting into a community and saying, I'm going to organize this community to make a mural, and then when the mural's done, you kind of go somewhere else. Rather, you're supporting an organization that's already on the ground sort of amplify their message, to bring more people in, and then they can do the follow-up, whatever the case may be. If they're healthcare campaign, for example, then they can kind of use that mural to mobilize their community to whatever ends or whatever goals they have in mind. And so then they do the job of community organizing, community building, where your job is sort of supporting that work. At least that's my philosophy. Yeah. Hi.
I have a question. So is there like any other area in Minnesota you hope to do your artwork in? Like I specifically suggest you should go to Southwest Minnesota, especially because there's like a high Latino population over there. That's unrepresented.
Are you from there?
Yeah, from
Oh.
Worthington.
Oh, let's make a mural there.
Yeah, let's go.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been wanting to do that for years, and I don't know anybody in Worthington, so.
Yeah, literally, we can make it happen. I know.
All right, yeah, yeah, no, I'm serious. I've been wanting to go to Worthington for a while, but again, it's sort of like you have to get a local connection, otherwise you're just sort of like, you know, what am I supposed to do when nobody knows who you are, and you also end up doing something that's not necessarily right for the community. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Anybody else interested in a mural project in your local community? Thank you so much, Aaron.
Thank you.